This is a workshop on simple JavaScript mapping, or let's make a map in Leaflet. It was originally designed and given during the New York City Digital Humanities Week in 2018, but because of security concerns, very few people were able to attend the workshop, so I've decided to put it online. My name is Moacir Zapereira, and I'll be leading you in the workshop. My Twitter name, Museus, and the hashtag for this year's NYC DH Week are here on the front page. And I'd like to thank the organizers for finding time for the workshop and for finding space. Anyway, today, in this short time, we're going to build a simple map in JavaScript that highlights a few geographic points mentioned in the Langston Hughes poem, Could Be. The map will look something like this. So I didn't know this poem until Alba Newman Holmes presented a paper, Could Be Langston Hughes as Situationist Cartographer, at a special session I convened at the MLA convention in 2015. But it's a good poem to map because there are a few specific places mentioned, only 5, and even though there are only 5 places mentioned, it already demonstrates some of the troubles that one runs into when making maps. Before we go any further though, let's download the files we'll be using for this workshop. So please go to this top URL to download a zip file and unzip it into your computer's desktop. The second link is the link to this presentation, so if you want to copy-paste some of the text and paste it into the files as you're working along, you can do that through there. When you unzip the file, you should have a folder that looks something like this. The icons may look a bit different, but the point is that there are 2 folders and 3 files. So now, even though we talk about a web page as though it's a single thing, what you see in your browser is typically generated by processes that rely on several files, and you see some of those files here. More concretely, one way to think of a website is sort of as a sentence, a process that creates a certain thing, that's made up also of parts of speech. So the HTML file contains the basic semantic building blocks of the page, including metadata about it and instructions to put a box of content here, or a map there, or a paragraph there. CSS, or style sheets, are the adjectives. They explain how those building blocks should look, what size the text should be, what color the background should be, what the margins should be, and so on. We'll barely touch on CSS in this workshop. And finally, there's JavaScript, the focus of this workshop. JavaScript is the verbs, the process, the movement. Anything on a website that involves motion or reaction is likely a JavaScript process, something like draw a map, or zoom in, or change the color. Similarly, and in true autopoietic fashion, JavaScript can create HTML and CSS. But it all does start with the HTML. So open up the index.html file in a text editor like Text Wrangler or Atom. Atom is my preferred free text editor for beginners to use. And when you open up the index.html file, you see that there's quite a bit going on in these 19 or so lines, but they should demonstrate the general structure and syntax of an HTML file and hence of a web page. So note that there's a head and that there's a body. The head includes metadata about the page, like what its title is, but it also tells the browser where to look for CSS files. So here we're downloading 2. One is the Bootstrap CSS file from a server on the internet, and the other is just the styles CSS file that's on your computer. Bootstrap is a service that provides a set of templates that help make your page look nice quickly. Then, in the body, we see a div, which is an arbitrary block, and that div has 2 elements inside it, another div with an ID of response, and a heading, the h1 tag. The h1 and the response div then also have some text inside of them. At the bottom of the body, you see a handful of script tags. Like the CSS in the header, these indicate to the browser where to go looking for JavaScript. The first file is jQuery, which is a set of functions that help make dynamic web pages. The next 2 are related to Bootstrap, and the last, sandbox.js, is the local file on your computer. So we'll spend the next half of this workshop with that file. Now, if you were to open up index.html in a browser with JavaScript disabled, it would look something like this, where all you see is the text that you saw in index.html. But if you do actually open it in your browser, which you can do by double-clicking on index.html, you'll see that there is different text under the header. Somehow, the JavaScript is manipulating the HTML and changing the text and coloring the background. So let's open up sandbox.js and see what is happening. We'll go into more detail about the top and bottom lines of this file later, so you can ignore them for now. Briefly, they instruct the browser to wait a second and then change the text of the div with the ID of response and color it green. What we're interested in is the text itself. So change that line of "this text is coming from JavaScript" to something else, save the JavaScript file, and reload the web page. Your change should now appear. But note the syntax here, however. There's the keyword return, then the text in double quotes, and then a semicolon. That's a complete statement, and statements end with semicolons in JavaScript. If it didn't work, make sure that you surrounded your text with quotes and make sure that your text editor isn't converting quotes to smart quotes. Once it works, pat yourself on the back because you are now a JavaScript programmer. Putting the text into double quotes creates a string, which is a piece of data that JavaScript recognizes. Two other basic ones are numbers, which are just numbers without the double quotes, and booleans, which are either true or false, again, without quotes. We'll be working with numbers a little bit and not with booleans. Booleans come up implicitly later on. So change line 6 of sandbox.js to perform some math, like noted here. Save and reload your web page, and congratulations, now you have a very clumsy calculator. Programming as such becomes more powerful once you can start saving time by using variables. The examples here don't actually do that, save time that is, but they do illustrate the process of defining variables and assigning values to those variables. In JavaScript, there are a few ways to define a variable, but one is to use the let keyword, then name the variable, then add an equal sign, then the value, and a semicolon. From the let result line, however, you can see that you can evaluate values when assigning them to a variable, and then the variable can be reused later, like in the return line. Now, just like a baby's first steps are clumsy and inefficient, so is the coding, but the goal here is to see how these things work first. There are 3 more data types that we'll talk about that are more complex, because they interact with the previous data types. First are arrays. Arrays are lists of data. Every item in an array can be a string, a number, or even another array. The items are separated by commas and enclosed in brackets. Objects, the next data type, they have properties. That's basically it. In this example, the object is indicated with curly braces and it has 2 properties, a name property and an age property. A string is assigned to the name property and a number is assigned to the age property. Functions are where the action happens. If JavaScript is the verbs of a web page, functions are the verbs of JavaScript. In fact, in sandbox.js, if you look at it again, you'll see that the top and bottom lines are chains of functions, and what you're typing with return is inside a function. Return actually is a keyword that tells a function to stop and send a value, the return value, back to whatever called the function. We'll discuss this in a few more slides. Back to arrays. Arrays are lists of data, and that data can be of any type. The way you access a specific member of an array is by using its index value, which is what order it's in the list. Surprisingly, the first item's index is 0, the second's is 1, and so on. This is confusing, so when I teach it, I tend to talk about a 0th, 1th, 2th, and 3rd item in an array. Once you assign an array to a variable, you can call a specific member by using the index number associated with that number in brackets, like in this example. Create your own array and have your web page return a specific member from the array. Next, objects have properties. That's about all there is to them. You access the properties using dot notation as noted here. Properties can be any data type. They can be strings, numbers, arrays, other objects. But when a property is a function, it's usually called a method. There are two methods in your sandbox.js file, .html and .addClass. They are both methods belonging to a JavaScript object that represents the bit of HTML code that creates the response div. So this part is purposely vague and indistinct, but then again, so are objects. They can contain any kind of property you can dream up. Create an object of your own with some properties and access them in your sandbox.js file. Finally, there are functions. So this section is very short because it is hard to use functions in the way the sandbox.js file is set up. But you can see what their basic syntax is here. The keyword function followed by parentheses. Inside the parentheses, you can define parameters that are passed into the function. These are variables that are available inside the function to work with. In this example, we're not using any, so we keep that part blank in between the parentheses. Then there are braces holding the logic of the function. In this case, that's just the return statement. But one way to see how functions work is by looking back at that sandbox file a little bit differently. So I'll go through this line by line. In the first line, we call the built-in JavaScript function setTimeout, which takes two parameters, a function and a time. And what setTimeout basically does is it tells the browser to run the function after a certain amount of time has elapsed. We see the time as the last bit of information here on the bottom, which means that everything between is the function that's supposed to run after 1,000 milliseconds, or 1 second. Now this function calls a function called $. This is shorthand for jQuery, which means that we're running a jQuery function and passing it a parameter. In this case, a string of # response. The jQuery function is telling the browser to grab the chunk of HTML with an ID of response. It's selecting it. So now that we have that chunk of HTML, it's a JavaScript object, which means that it has properties or methods. So the first method we use is on the next line, HTML. The HTML method takes a function and changes the content of the HTML that jQuery grabbed with the use of with whatever is in that other function. So we call yet another function. Then that function returns yet another function that returns the string functions inside functions. Then we execute another method on that chunk of HTML. So .html is the first method, and then a second method, .addClass. And this adds some classes to the HTML as a string. Classes style the HTML, and alert success classes are what make the text get a green background through Bootstrap. And finally, at the end, we have this time, the 1,000 milliseconds, or 1 second. So this is very confusing, and it's a very weird way to think of causality. What we think of typically as a step-by-step set of instructions, wait a second, get the HTML, change the text, change the color. These instructions aren't a list of commands, but rather functions and methods embedded inside one another. We won't be writing anything this complex in this workshop, but it's useful to try and start thinking nestedly in this way. So that's a pretty quick introduction to JavaScript. And the funny thing is, it covers all the fundamental aspects of the language. Everything else that we're going to do just builds on these 6 data types and how they interact with each other, using the 2 things I haven't mentioned so far, which are conditional statements and loops. But in order to build on what we've got so far, let's move to Leaflet. Leaflet is a set of methods that work on a leaflet object that draws a map on a web page and lets users interact with it. It's surprisingly powerful for how basic it is, and though there are mapping solutions online that are easier, like Google Maps and Carto, none offers you the chance to get close to your data by manipulating it in JavaScript. And in this part of the workshop, we switch from the files at the root of the directory in the zip file to the files inside the could-be folder. If you open the index.html inside the could-be folder in your text editor, you'll see that it's more or less the same as the earlier index.html file. But it's loading an extra style sheet in the header, and there are a few more script tags at the bottom. The extra style sheet is from Leaflet, and the scripts at the bottom are Leaflet from the internet and 2 files from your computer, data.js and couldbe.js. Most notably, the response div is missing. or the div with the ID of response. Instead, there are two new divs. One is called map, and the other is called poem, but both are empty. Yet if you double-click on index.html and open it in your browser, you see that the page isn't mostly empty. There's actually a poem there. So how did it get there? The answer, of course, is through JavaScript, in much the same way we've been doing so far in this workshop. But the details for that are saved for later. It's actually being done at the bottom of the data.js file. But we want to do something with this big expanse above the poem. Namely, we want it to be a map. So if you open up the couldbe.js file in your text editor, you'll see that there's already quite a bit there, but it's all commented out, which means it's surrounded by these slash and asterisks. So as a first step, delete the top line, the slash and the asterisk, and the last line, an asterisk and a slash. Once this file is uncommented, you can save and reload the page in your browser. A map should now load showing Washington Square Park. So let's go over every line of the JavaScript here. First, we define a variable, map, and assign to it the return value of the map method for the L object. L is a variable that stands for Leaflet, and it gets loaded when we added that line about Leaflet to the index.html. L has many methods, and one of these is map, which defines a map based on the name of the div you pass it, which in this case is, again, map. So in short, this line takes the div with an ID map and turns it into a leaflet map, while also creating a variable, map, that we can use from then on to manipulate what we've got in our map. The second line uses the tile layer method on the L leaflet object to define a tile layer with some properties. The tile layer is the background of the map, the part with all the streets and water. And then at the end of defining it, we use the add_to method to add this layer to the map. Without that add_to, we just have a blank square. We would just have a blank square that's gray. Then the next statement defines a variable, NYU, and assigns it to an array. In this case, the 0th element of the array is the latitude, and the 1th element is the longitude. And then finally, we use the setView method that map has, because it's a leaflet map, to center the map at the NYU latitude and longitude, and then we also set the zoom level to 14. And I know that that's a lot, but these are just the initial conditions of the map. You set the tile layer once and forget it. You set the center and zoom level once and forget it. But it's also important to notice that there's nothing here that you don't yet already know what it is. It's all methods, and then in the tile layer, we see that we're passing two parameters to it. This URL that tells it what kind of tiles to draw, and then an object with the various options that we're passing to it too. So we'll see this again. Now, Leaflet lets us draw markers, lines, and polygons. It also lets us attach pop-ups to those items. So let's draw one of each, a marker, a polyline, and a polygon, just for fun. For the circle marker, it's expecting a coordinate, a latitude and a longitude. So we can reuse the NYU variable. For the line or polyline, it's the same thing, but it's just an array of arrays, where each sub-array is a latitude and a longitude. Since NYU already is an array with a latitude and a longitude, it works great as the first point in the line. A polygon is the same as a polyline, except Leaflet fills it in. But the fundamentals are all still here. We're using three methods the L object has, passing them arrays as parameters, and then using the add_to method to add them to the map. You can use any coordinates you like and zoom out as appropriate, but these are the basics. My marker, polyline, and polygon create this map. Now, let's take a closer look at the poem, which is from 1949. So you see that there are 5 different places mentioned in the poem, and 2 are mentioned twice. So what's interesting, or what becomes peculiar when you actually start mapping this poem, is that at first the poem has a certain kind of universality that it gestures towards. That it could be any one of many African American communities in the United States, at the one at Hastings Street in Detroit, or Lenox Avenue in Harlem, and that there are these kinds of similarities about pawning a watch and pawning one's heart. But it was a little bit tricky to find two of these places, Hastings Street and Fifth and Mound, and that's because they no longer exist. There were once centers of African American communities in Detroit and Cincinnati, respectively, but both were bulldozed away to make room for I-75. So what is initially a poem about a sort of universalized African American urban experience becomes instead also a kind of elegy for African American communities that have been destroyed by urban renewal or by the Interstate Project, which gives a new kind of spin to the poem. That's something that only jumped out to me when I started mapping it. But let's put a dot on the map for all 5 of these locations. Open up couldbe/data.js in your text editor. And now I've collected the coordinates for all 5 places already and put them in data.js. But even this is a little bit tricky, and this is what I said at the beginning of the workshop about how mapping things becomes difficult, because how do you figure out what coordinates Hastings Street has if it basically doesn't exist? Or Fifth and Mound, which definitely doesn't exist anymore. I made these decisions, but they indicate that the map gives this fantasy of specificity and exactness, but it doesn't earn it. And it's important to always remember that uncertainty plays a large role in what's going on here. So here we have this array called points. And you don't have to edit anything, but I want you to see that this is an array, points, and each element of the array is an object. And each object has 3 properties: a coords property, a name property, and a mentions property. The coords property is just like the NYU variable was. It's an array with a latitude and a longitude. The name is the name, and the mentions refers to how many times the place is mentioned in the poem. So because this file is loaded before the couldbe.js file is, the points variable is available to us inside couldbe.js. So now we can get fancy. How can we get those 5 points on the map? We know how to do it once, just l.circleMarker parentheses the coordinates. But what about for 5 times? We could just repeat that 5 times, but wouldn't it be nicer if we could just loop over the array and every time through pick up a new set of coordinates and add it to the map? Of course that would be nicer, and that's in fact exactly what we do here. Arrays, and remember points is an array, they have a method called forEach, which lets you write a function that then manipulates every item in the array one at a time. That item is referred to using the parameter you assign to the function in forEach. So in this case, it's location. So even though I don't define location anywhere, there's no let location, location is sort of defined in the background when forEach is launched. And every single time we step through the array, it creates that variable called location and assigns the object to that variable. So the first time through the loop, location has the coordinates for Hastings Street, it has a name property called Hastings Street, and for the mentions property, it's 2. The last time through, it's Rampart. So the coordinates property is for Rampart, the coords property, the name property is Rampart, and the mentions property is just 1. So with just 3 lines of code, or 4 depending on how you want to count it, we've added 5 dots to the map. And now the purpose of this kind of looping starts to make sense. But the map is still zoomed in on NYU, and we want to see all of the dots within the entire lower 48. So in Leaflet, the map object, or the map variable, has another method, fitBounds, that lets you draw a box around how much of the map you want to have visible. So these 2 coordinates, 23 minus 125 and 50 minus 65, are corners of the lower 48 of the US. So if we add this, it redraws the map and zooms out to include all of the lower 48 states. Now, we can do even better, because circle markers have another method associated with them called bindPopup. And that lets us define what the popup for the marker is. Since every object in the points array has a name property, we can make a popup for each marker with the place's name in it. So you can change the couldbe.js file just a bit, just add this one line, bindPopup, save and reload the web page. Zoom out and you see all 5 points, and if you click on one, the pop-up shows up. Finally, let's change the color of the markers. Blue isn't very exciting. Circle markers, polylines, and polygons, when you create them, when you use that method, they actually take two parameters. So far we've only been using one, but you can add a second parameter. The first is the coordinates, an array of coordinates like we've done so far. The second is an object with properties that define the style of the marker or the line or the polygon. In Leaflet, the color property refers to the outline or stroke color, and the fill color with a capital C, fill color property refers to the shading inside the circle marker or polygon. So I've picked green here, but you can use any hex value for a color, or some other colors are predefined. But also, you may notice that I don't use green as a string in the options object. Instead, I define a variable color and use it. The reason for that is that it will make things easier in a second. But as you can see, I define an object called options, give it these two properties, color and fill color, and then I pass that object as the second parameter to L circle marker. And the result is that we get green dots. Now earlier I said that looping and conditionals were most of what was missing from this initial introduction to JavaScript. So by putting the 5 dots on the map, we've already used a loop, specifically a for each loop, on an array. Now let's look at conditionals. They test whether a statement is true or false, those Boolean values I introduced at the beginning of the workshop but haven't yet used. If the statement evaluates to true, a conditional does one thing. Otherwise, we can tell it to do another. Now notice what happens here. First, we define the variable color, but we don't assign it a value. Next, we start a conditional with an if statement. The triple equal sign basically turns that statement to mean if it is the case that the value of location mentions is exactly 2, do something, which is set the value of color to green. Then we have an else statement, which is what happens if it is not the case. And in this case, when location.mentions is not exactly 2, we assign the value red to color. It repeats this process, this test, with every location, and so we end up with a map with 2 green circle markers for Hastings Street and Lenox Avenue, because they're mentioned twice, and 3 red markers, who are mentioned only once, just as we would expect. So save and reload, and you get the map. And that's it. We've reached the final view of the map. Now, there's a lot left still to figure out about JavaScript and so on. And one of the things is, throughout this workshop, I say things like, well, Leaflet has a method, this has a method, arrays have a method. And it's useful to know where to go to find out about these methods. So you can read about the methods at the fantastic manuals that all of these different pieces of software have. And I still use these whenever I'm programming. I always look up quickly to remind myself about the particulars of a certain method or how you use it. And then at the end here is a link to my longer course that also uses could be as an example, the JavaScripting English major, which is a 15-session course for undergraduate students to learn how to use JavaScript, undergraduate students in the humanities to learn how to use JavaScript. So thank you very much, and thanks for watching this.